Good day. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, Ukrainian philosopher and historian, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Eye on Ukraine. And in the last episode, I covered Vladimirovich Putin's rise to power. So this is the second in three-part series of falling back on some of the content of my book, Putin's Obsession with Ukraine, an Ahabian moment. The Ahabian meaning like Ahab, Putin is so obsessed with Ukraine that he's willing to see it destroyed at the expense of his whole country. And that's what I think is really going on. Anyway, so this is the second in a tripart series on Ukraine and Putin's obsession with Ukraine. And today I want to talk about Putin himself. And I want to talk about how he came to have the sort of political vision that he has, if indeed it can be called a political vision or a political philosophy. Now, I talked about last time that Putin was no ideologue. He was no man of principles. He was no man of people. He made no large campaign promises. He didn't have any to make. It was assumed that he would follow in the footsteps of Boris Yeltsin, who aimed to democratize Russia. And it was unclear just to what extent Putin was, if Yeltsin was sincere about that, but it was unclear to what extent he'd be able to accomplish that. He was a known bibulous figure, always on a Brannigan, always drunk, frequently drunk. And he was, though a large figure, he was sort of an embarrassing figure for the Russian people. They were looking for any sort of change of pace from Yeltsin. So again, he made no campaign promises. He didn't campaign. He dispositionally was stern. He was severe, serious, cold. And he had, as I said before, sort of pouty contempt. So by his own visage, he wasn't the sort of person that were he to campaign, he probably would do very well. He was no person of the people. So he had to be sort of whisked into the presidential role by people around him who could make him sort of a popular figure. And as I said before, there were a series of disasters in Moscow, bombings, 4 or 5. And it's believed, and I'm one who believes this too, that these bombings were intentional. They were to be blamed on the Chechens, with whom the Russians were having difficulties all the way from 1991 to 2001 and so forth. And they were to be blamed on the Chechens, and Putin was, in Moscow and several other cities, Putin was going to be called to the fore as the savior who stops these terrorist activities. So if I'm correct and the others from whom I'm drawing are correct, it seems to me he comes to the president through sanguinary means, through artificially inducing terrorist activities or terrorist events in Russia, just so he can be called upon to save them. Anyway, so I think my view is early on, I think Putin was sincere about integration with the West and about democratizing. And he went some ways toward that early on in his presidency by stabilizing the economy, which was erratic, the one he inherited. And, so he was ardently, I think, not ardently, he was consistently pushing towards westernizing Russia. And somewhere along the line, things went awry. Now, Putin, as we know, is a 5-term Russian president. In 2000, he won with 53% of the votes on the first election. There was no need for a second election because he won with the majority. In 2004, 72%, 2012, 64%. He wasn't on the ballot in 2008 because the Russian Constitution did not allow for more than 2 terms as president. He fixes that in 2012, runs again and wins 64%, changes the Constitution, In 2018, he runs and wins with 77%, 2022 with 88%. And he is, for the most part, dictator for life. I don't think that'll be a long time. I don't think I don't think he's going to live much longer, like our Ukrainian President Zelensky said. I think that his statement that Putin will die soon is more of a bluff. In effect, not that he has any sort of incurable disease that anyone of which anyone knows, but the fact that it is a sort of a gambit on the part of Zelensky to make Putin even more paranoid than he already is, looking over his shoulder here and there to see if there's a bullet aimed at him, a bullet with his name on it. So early on, I think Putin is literally committed to westernizing Russia, integrating Russia insofar as he's able to integrate Russia with the West, specifically the European nations. So he says early on, victory is only possible when every citizen of this country feels that the values we offer yield positive changes in their day-to-day lives, that they're beginning to live better, eat better, feel safer, and so on. In this sense, one can say we are still very far from our destination. I think we are still at the start of that road. I'm always chary when politicians add the etc. or and so on. We're beginning to live better, eat better, feel safer, and so on. It's covering these things rather glibly and briefly instead of giving you a specific articulation of what a vision is for the future. It says, live better, eat better, feel safer, and so on. So to me, psychologically, this means that he's really not committed to this. He never really thought out what it means for a better Russia. And I'll say more on that in a little bit. But I do think, we must understand that he inherited a system that was entirely corrupt, right? It was, for the most part, incapable, if not incapable, at least difficult of reforming. The political players at the time were just too ensconced in the corruptive measures that were being used all the time, namely the oligarchical people who were running the show. So it was very difficult to work one's way into the sort of capitalist free market economy, if that was one goal. So the oligarchs were still, any sort of attempt at reform was still met by our oligarchical resistance. And the oligarchs were always intent on filling their bulging pockets at every step of the way. So if he was serious about democratizing, it was a very, very difficult path ahead of him. The same story that Ukraine had when Ukraine itself, right, declared freedom in 1991 and worked its way. At some point, the inflation that Ukraine has experienced was over 4,000% at one point, which was crippling and ridiculous. All right, so what happened with Putin is at some point, and again, here I'm going to talk about his political philosophy as far as he has one. How did he shape his political views? What were they? What was his political philosophy? Putin met resistance at every step of the way insofar he was trying to westernize or democratize, and for good reasons, right? There was his Georgian policy in 2008, where he went in and just obliterated Georgia in a very short time. Georgia wanting to be an independent nation and exercise its own freedoms and sovereignty. The problem with Chechnya from 1991, and when Putin comes in as prime minister, this is a test that Yeltsin gives him. He comes in and just bombs the hell out of Grozny and settles that issue pretty clearly. By the time 2001, Russia has quieted the Chechens, and they're not so interested in their liberty. So many hundreds of thousands had to leave Chechnya. So he's already got heavy-handed, strong-arm tactics when it comes to dealing with dissent. That's what he learned in his days as a KGB man, right? When his office at the building at Dresden after the fall of the Berlin Wall was being assailed, and he talked about this special moment where he asked about his superiors, what should I do? And he got nothing in response. He said that day Moscow was silent. Putin, his political philosophy would be shaped by answering that difficult notice, that difficult problem. Moscow under Putin would never be silent, always be active. He would not tolerate dissent, right? He would meet any sort of dissent with immediate, decisive, and if needed, sanguinary activity. Kill people who are responsible for the uprising, and that'll stop that. So we're at this moment, I think, by at least 2003, Putin faces a sort of crossroad, and we can call it, Gorbachev might have been on the path of de-Stalinization. Do you want to get on camera? Is that what you want, or you just want to go down, huh? What do you want to do? You want to go down? Anyways, we have this path of de-Stalinization on which Gorbachev was, and the path on which the path that I should say that Putin chooses is re-Stalinization, right? He's not going to look to the future. He's not going to look to the West. He's not going to look to these democratic nations that embrace liberty and all the other human rights that presumably align themselves so neatly with freedom. He's going to adopt a super conservatism that aligns itself with Russian orthodoxy, right? He's going to look back, and when he looks back, what he looks at is the greatness of Russia's history. He's going to look back at the military conquests of Russia as an empire. He goes back to Kiev Rus, and he looks at the great Vladimir the Great and Yaroslav the Wise, right? And he looks back to Ivan III, Ivan the Terrible or Despicable, which Ivan IV, in other words, Peter the Great, Catherine II, or Catherine the Great of Russia and their great military conquests. And he looks also to the USSR at Joseph Stalin, whatever sort of criticisms are constantly thrown at him. Putin's going to say this is a figure, when considering his military accomplishments, was a great person. He always, when he refers to Stalin, is cautious to note that he was, in some sense, a questionable person, but must acknowledge that he is the one that led us to victory in the Great Patriotic War. He wasn't the first to mention this, but Putin really plays up this Great Patriotic War, the cost of Russian lives lost in the Great Patriotic War, World War II, and Russia's great role in it in fighting back, turning back the Nazis, right? Hence, Ukrainians will always be called Nazis or neo-Nazis or fascists and so forth. Because many Ukrainians fought on the other side, and that's a topic for a different discussion. So the view I offer is I call Putin's political thinking, his political philosophy, muscular militarism. Svetlana Alexievich, who's a Belarusian writer, she writes in her book La Fin de l'Homme Rouge, the end of the red man, or better, more loosely translated, the goal of Russians. She says 70% of our economy was in the service of the army, and also our best minds, physicians, mathematicians. And then she adds, there is no line between a state of peace and a state of war. We're always at a state of war. So what is characteristic? What are the characteristic features of muscular militarism? Embrace of autocracy, in other words, the rule of one man, and given complete authority to use his own judgment to decide the fate of Russia. Statism over individualism. Individualism would be what the liberal countries champion. John Stuart Mill, before that, the great Thomas Jefferson, about whom I write I've published over 28 books on Jefferson. Possession and exercise of political and military strength. Don't be shy about your military strength. Be proud of it, boast of it, have parades, and use it when you need to use it. Anti-Westernism, which manifests itself in what could be called xenophobia, fear of others, and illiberalism. We're not going to be champion human rights and liberty. In fact, these things are really pseudo values and not values at all. They're false values. Conservatism. Okay, fifth, Russian messianism, spiritualism, moralism of the sort that's linked with Russian orthodoxy. Six, contempt for political weakness. This is somewhat mentioned in number three. I talk about possession and exercise of political military strength. When I talk about contempt of political weakness, this is a broader category. This entails just political strength in any manifestation when you're talking about cyber attacks and things like that, or any kind of quasi wars, any kind of ways of exercising power over another polity, another nation state to Russia's advantage. And Russian philopatry, the Greek word, an English word from the Greek roots meaning love of your own fatherland, right? Love of your own country. I sum this in my book by saying for Putin, we are what we are. In other words, we are what we always have been. Now, I want to take you to a map and show you what I can about this notion of get it up on a larger screen. Here we see the Russian Empire, or the growth of Russia from its modest roots we get in the brown, where Moscow, this is prior to the 16th century. Moscow starts after the collapse of Kiev Rus here, which is in this area. So we have from 1533 to 1687, no, excuse me, prior to 1533, we have this sort of area which defines Moscow and Russia, if you want to call it. Then in the next couple hundred years, we see an extraordinary expansion of Russia throughout the Ural Mountains and Siberia and so forth, all the way right to the Pacific Ocean. In the orange from 1689 to 1801, we have, we have the Great Northern War from 1700 to 1721. Peter the Great defeats Sweden's Charles XII, and so we have expansion throughout here. Peter the Great builds St. Petersburg, which is going to be the new capital of Russia. And notice how close it is to, well, not that Moscow's that far, but Petersburg is closer to the West. And Peter the Great always wanted to Westernize. He realized the superiority of Western culture, both in battle when it came to that, and culture as well. And so he's always westward looking. Under the Romanovs, Alexander I, we have additional properties down here. Nicholas I, we have additions to the empire. Alexander II, we have additions to the south and to the east. And with Alexander III, we have additions to the south. So why this is such an interesting map, and of course with the USSR, we have additional territorial gains and so forth. Russia has always been a polity, a state that is obsessed and consumed with expansion. Why I find that intriguing is because it's also been a polity or state that's never been concerned with the well-being of the people. Russia today has, I think, some 180 million people, which is the United States has over 300 million. So it has easily the largest, it's the largest country, right, in the world. And yet there are very few people who live in Russia. There is today large brain drain. Uh, it's never developed the land that it has. It's obsessed with acquisition of land, and yet it's never developed that land. It doesn't know what to do with it as it stands. There are two great cities here. We see St. Petersburg. Putin was born there, and Moscow. And other than that, one might say that all of Russia is a bit of a backwater. There's extraordinary poverty, penury, even in most parts, especially in the eastern parts of Russia. There's no desire. So we have this sort of, with the development of the two great cities, it's all westward leaning, and all the other parts of Russia are sort of being neglected. And I think that's still the case today. One could certainly make that case. All right, so I mean, it's a sort of enlightening picture when one looks at it, to have such a large expanse of land in one's possession as a country or an empire. Let's call it an empire, because Putin wants to return to those days of empirism. And all right, let's return to script here. So what we have is, I think we have Putin being substantially drawn to westernizing, like Peter the Great, one of his heroes. He is substantially drawn to westernizing Russia, and the West is not so intrigued by allowing Stalin into Western culture, allowing it into, for example, Putin even at one point expressed interest. I think it was an interview with David Frost, saying Frost said something about NATO, and Putin says, well, I guess I could see Russia as part of NATO. It's a very extraordinary claim that he makes, that Russia could be part of NATO. This is early on in his presidency. Of course, he turns around and backtails. Russia could be part of NATO. But then, by at least by 2003, maybe, well, I shouldn't say at least, maybe even at most by 2003, maybe a little bit later, he has a turn of mind. I think the turn of mind is mostly triggered by the West's reluctance to embrace Putin and Russia as one of them. Too much of a backwater. They're too used to using sanguinary military measures to solve problems. It's too much of a gamble for NATO to integrate, to bring Russia into its union, for European nations to embrace Russia as a sort of easterly European nation. So what happens? He goes from a political reformer with Western liberal ideals, to some extent embraced that. To what extent you could say he ever embraced liberalism is questionable, because his methods were always strong-armed. But he goes to what I call a muscular militarist autocrat, right? And as today, it's morphed into the sort of autocracy where Putin is desperately doing anything he can do right now to cling on to power. When the Ukrainian president says Putin will die soon, as I said before, I take him serious. I take that as a threat from Zelensky to Putin to say, cover your ass, because there might be bullets flying at you. Even if not, he wants this paranoid leader to be even more paranoid. But what happens, anybody who's an autocrat or dictator, been in power too long, things start to crumble, right? The economy, as I mentioned a number of times, is in such a state of decay, or even more abundity. It's dying, and it's going to take a long time for Russians to make a comeback, as it were. The Russian people are not even having babies. They can't afford to have children. It's too expensive. Even in the larger cities, people are thinking twice about having one child. So this is why Putin has stolen thousands of Ukrainian children from Ukraine, from the Donbass areas and other parts of Ukraine, to bring them to Russia, to bring them up as Russian soldiers so they could fight against Ukraine, they could fight against NATO, and so forth, right? So one can ask what triggered this change from sort of Western embrace of Western ideals to embrace of sort of anti-Westernism, a policy of anti-Westernism. And this happens. One answer is, I offer in the book, in my book, is that, well, this is what happens when you take someone who's trained in KGB tactics and you place him in the presidency of Russia, the largest nation in the world. He doesn't know anything but strong arm tactics. So he doesn't know anything about diplomacy, about polite public speaking, polite conversation. He knows about trickery, deceitfulness, and such things. So at some point, diplomacy is not going to be an option, right? So he's a KGB person. So that's why he had a shift in policy. The West could never embrace him. Another answer I give in chapter 2 of my book is the sort of people that had strong influence on his political thinking. Peter Stolypin, Anton Denikin, Joseph Stalin, Ivan Ilyin, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, among others, and Alexander Dugin, I should say. All right, let's look at each of these quickly. I don't want to spend a lot of time, but these are persons who had a profound influence on the shift in Putin's thinking away from Westernism to more conservative ideals. Pyotr Stolypin was born in 1862. He died in 1911. Not a very long-lived person. He was prime minister of Russia from 1906 to 1911 under the rule of Tsar Nicholas II. Now, Stolypin was a conservative liberal. He focused on slow liberal reforms. He was an advocate of liberation of the peasants, right? He believed in the peasants should be able to own land, but he was not a radical. He didn't take things too far. He was an advocate of using strong arm tactics like Putin's to put forth his reforms. In fact, the noose became known as Stolypin's necktie. So he wound up killing so many people by hangings. He was tasked with the revitalization, with the recrudescence of Russia when Russia lost a war, astonishingly, with Japan, right? He also was, like many of the other people that influenced Putin, was one who wanted to revivify Slavic identity. In other words, let's have the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, again, converge with the Russians and understand that we can have a unity of these three great peoples, that they're not separate peoples. After all, they're one people, given their heritage, given their roots in Kiev Rus, or so the story goes, right? Another important person was General Anton Denikin, who was the great ruler during the Russian Revolution of the White Army. The White Army was fighting against the Bolsheviks, the White Army, on behalf of sort of Russian conservatism, as it were. Putin called him one of 4 legendary army commanders. Why Putin was interested in Denikin is because Putin really thought that the Bolshevik turn, the Sovietization of Russia, was a large mistake, was a sort of turning point in the wrong direction that impeded the growth and the greatness of Russia. It was just a long period of time when things degenerated, when Russians turned against their Russian ideals and went towards Marxist communist ideals, which Putin thought really was not going anywhere. So he had a large respect, like a lot of the people that he looked up to, for people who were anti-Bolshevik. Denikin, of course, was one. Now, Denikin was also anti-Semitic. He thought Jews were agents of communism, and there were some Jewish people in the Communist Party, in prominent positions in the Communist Party. So, to the extent to which Putin is anti-Semitic is a difficult question. I tend to think he probably is. If you listen to his talks and writings, you get some strong hints of it, but they're hints without definite declarations of anti-Semitism. So perhaps he has anti-Semitism in common with Dedekind. Putin says, Western curators have placed an ethnic Jew. This is some evidence for his anti-Semitism. He's talking about Zelensky. Western curators have placed an ethnic Jew with Jewish roots and origins at the helm of modern Ukraine. In my opinion, they seem to be covering up an anti-human essence that is embedded in the foundation of the modern Ukrainian state. So I'm not clear what Putin is saying here is the notion of electing a Jew as president, a sort of cover up, a sort of deflection, sort of rationalization for anti-Semitism in Ukraine. Right? Ukrainians can't be anti-Semitic because they put a Jew in power. It's one way to read this. Another way to read this is to read into it and say, well, Zelensky needs to be removed because he's a Jew. Now, I'm not going to tell you that that's the way to read it, but that's one alternative reading. All right. Now, Joseph Stalin, 1878 to 1953, the great dictator of the Soviet Union. In my book, Stalin and the Ukraine, from 1928, 1933, where I cover Holodomor and the events leading up to it. I call it Whisk of the Red Broom. It's primarily titled. I talk about Joseph Stalin. Now, I think Putin really has tremendous respect for Stalin, right? And he's very careful to express that because a lot of people a lot of Russians too are very chary about overly emphasizing the greatness of Stalin because of Holodomor, where he murdered over some 4 million Ukrainians and a few million other people in the Soviet Union for not collectivizing the farms, among other things, let them starve to death. He says, Stalin, of course, was the dictator, but under his leadership, the country won the Second World War, and the victory to a large extent is connected with his name. And his Victory Day speech on May 9, 2012, Putin says, Russia is consistent in its policy of strengthening security in the world. We have a great moral right in taking this principled, firm stand because it was our country that bore the brunt of the Nazi attack, met it with heroic resistance, traversed immense hardship, determined the war's outcome, routed the enemy, and liberated the world's peoples. Now, liberated the world's people. This victory provides a strong foundation for our young generations too, who must know and remember that they are the successors of victors, of true soldiers of freedom. Very, very important speech here, something that he ingeminates, he iterates and reiterates in other speeches, that the great war, the great victory, the greatness of Russia is shown in its suffering tragic losses during World War II, but being the catalyst that put down the Nazi assault on global security. So Russia needs to be seen as a sort of beacon or a harbinger of global security. It needs to be seen, so what he's saying here is that because of its role in World War II, Russia is the great global nation. It saved the world. It should have a central place in global affairs. And we're going to see this in Putin's push towards a sort of counter bloc to NATO, BRICS, right? Which is Britain, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and other nations gathering together as a sort of military and economic alternative to NATO, right? I think Putin sees BRICS as the unity of these several nations that are offering this alternative to NATO. He sees Russia in the lead, and Moscow is the main city involved in all of this. All right, so that's a very important speech, and Putin has done a lot with World War II in drawing young Russians towards a Russian national identity, the sort of statism that his muscular militarism embraces, right? Young people think Russia is a great nation because of that. And they're encouraged to join the military. In fact, Russian education, you look at their textbooks, they're all about introducing young men and young women to the great Russian military machine, encouraging young men to join the military and fight for Russia's greatness, take over more land. They don't have enough land, and go from there. Another key player is Ivan Ilyin, who was a Russian philosopher, orator, Slavophile, and monarchist, advocate of monarchy, 1883, 1854. A lot of people who write on Putin notice the love Putin had, or the influence that Ilyin had on Putin. Now, Ilyin preached Russian irredentism. Irredentism is sort of like all the lands that Russia may have lost. For example, the Soviet Union, we need to get them all back. Russia's a great nation. It had all these lands at some point in its empire, and all the lands that it ever had, it needs to have them back. They're always part of Russia. As if somehow when Russia conquers a land, if it loses that land, then it has a right to conquer it again because it once conquered it. Now, if any other nation, of course, he wants to deny that privilege to any other nation other than Russia, which is, of course, ridiculous. All right. Ilyin emphasized a strong state. He emphasized autocracy, Russian nationalism, and Ukrainophobia, anti-Bolshevism as well. The Ukrainophobia means hatred of Ukraine, not allowing Ukraine to have a separate identity from that of Russian. He was not a strong advocate of war, but he believed that war was the only alternative in extreme cases. Now, the most important influence on Putin's thinking, in my opinion, is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who died in 2008, a long-lived person who born in 1918. He was the Gulag Archipelago and other famous works that he wrote. He was a Soviet dissident, anti-Soviet Union, lifelong Orthodox Christian, a novelist and writer, and so forth, and a political thinker of some note. Solzhenitsyn preached love of God. I'm not so sure that Putin is a God-fearing person like Solzhenitsyn was, or a God-loving person at least, but he was an anti-Bolshevik. He also believed that Ukraine should never consider itself separate from Russia. He says, all the talk of a separate Ukrainian people existing since something like the 9th century and possessing it on its own non-Russian language is a recently invented falsehood. We all sprang from precious Kiev. This is Putin's going to say this time and time again. We all have the same roots. It's not true that they do. I'll talk about this some other occasion. But since we all sprang from Kiev and from the principalities of Kiev Rus, we have the same roots, so we can't claim to have a different identity. The argument is perfectly fallacious. It'd be like saying the American colonists came from, and Australians came from the mother country, England. At some point, they moved, they colonized North America and Australia and so forth. And even though they became separate countries, though having their roots in the mother country, they really are still part of England. So if England wanted to go to war and conquer, the United States, conquer Australia and so forth, they have a right to do so. So you can have common roots, and if you move on and you decide to form a separate identity, that's all well and good, right? Okay, so on February 21, 2022, just 3 days before the special military operation, Putin states, since time immemorial, the people living in the Southwest, right, in the four oblasts, which he currently occupies to some degree, of what has historically been Russian land, have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. The time immemorial. What was that? Even before Kiev Rus? That was the case before the 17th century when a portion of this territory rejoined the Russian state and thereafter, right? So he uses a lot of this propaganda that they all call themselves Russians. The fact that Moscow really came about in the 13th century or so, after the 13th, 14th century, after the fall of Kiev Rus, the Mongol invasion, where Kiev was overthrown. It was assailed and more than decimated, almost annihilated in 1250 AD. Moscow came into prominence thereafter. And in the sort of Muscovite literature, we don't see anything about roots in Kiev Rus till much later on. So a lot of this is historical fiction that is adopted by Solzhenitsyn and Putin. Now, like Putin plays off Solzhenitsyn. Their thinking here is identical. He says, Solzhenitsyn, if the Ukrainian people should genuinely wish to separate, no one would dare to restrain them by force, but the area is very heterogeneous indeed, many different types of people. And only the local population can determine the fate of a particular locality, while every ethnic minority created by this process in a given district must count upon the same kind of forbearance toward it. So the whole notion is if a province, if a certain group, land of people wants to separate, they have a right to do so, so long as they respect the ethnicity of the people. If the largest group of people there are Russian, and certain people called Ukrainians want to separate and declare this parcel of land Ukraine, in some sense, they have no right to do so because they're not respecting the ethnicity of the largest group of people. Putin says the same thing all the time. He says the situation in Ukraine today involves a forced change of identity. He's agreed. You can change your identity, but it can't be through force. The determination of nationality, particular in mixed families, is the right of every individual free to make his own choice. Right. But Putin would go on to say, if that is, if they want to make their own choice, if they're not respecting the ethnicity, say, of the Russian-speaking peoples, if they happen to be a majority, then they have no right to declare their own sovereignty. All right. Now, Putin says Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was the largest state of Europe. Slavic and other tribes across the vast territory and so forth were bound together by one language, which we now refer to as Old Russian. Notice as we were now refer to it, there really wasn't one language. There was communication between the various principalities all over Kiev Rus, and those principalities were ethnically influenced mightily by the tribes of people around them. When the Finnic and Slavic people, moved around in Kiev Rus. They had economic ties, the rule of the princes of the Rurik dynasty, and after the baptism of Rus, the Orthodox faith. So it talks about Saint Vladimir, who was baptized and had all of Kiev baptized, or most of Kiev baptized after he became Orthodox and so forth. So he wants to talk about, we have our roots in Kiev Rus, so we're all one people, right? And this is a lot of propagandist BS. Now, Solzhenitsyn, in his Russia in Collapse in 1998, he writes, talks about annexation of eastern and southern Ukraine. He said these were given to Ukraine, the Ukrainian SSR, by the Bolsheviks. They really weren't part of Ukraine, since those four oblasts that Putin is contesting right now were principally given to the Ukrainian SSR by the Bolsheviks. They don't speak on behalf of today's Russians, so the gift was given mistakenly, presumably. So they're really not part of Ukraine, and that's in some sense impetus for Putin going back in and trying to retake those territories. Of course, that's a small reason. He wants the mineral resources, and by his activities in 2022 show, he wants all of Ukraine, not just those parts of Ukraine and Crimea. Putin writes, modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era. Now, final influence is Alexander Dugin, who was born in 1962. He's often called Putin's brain. Now, the extent he's called a philosopher or political philosopher. When you read his work, it's very second rate, right? He's not a very consistent or clear thinker. He uses sort of a Hegelian dialectical scheme. I've studied Hegel. I've never made much sense of Hegel. Never made much sense of the German deconstructionists thereafter Hegel in the next century. And I don't think much of Dugin's thinking, but we can say a little bit about what he thought, what he continues to think. He says Ukraine is absolutely evil. It's liberal totalitarian. It's Nazi. In a fairly significant book, fairly significant in terms of its influence, 2009, he writes the fourth political theory, which is driven by a sort of Hegelian dialectic, collisions of thoughts, and then some sort of synthesis comes out. He says, takes three particular political views: communism, liberalism, and fascism. Communism being Marxism, and socialistic liberalism inclined toward individualism, leftism and rightism, and fascism being a sort of radical form of nationalism, usually with an autocratic leader. Now, he tends to think all this, that liberalism has won the day over these other two, but at some point there will be a fourth political theory that wins the day over liberalism. He says the problem with liberalism is there's glorification of total freedom and the independence of the individual from any kind of limits, including reason, moral identity, discipline, and so on. So it's liberalism, he thinks, is anti-rational, anti-morality, anti-identity, anti-discipline. So he's speaking here for a form of conservatism that will line itself up neatly with Solzhenitsyn and other prominent Russian thinkers that influenced Putin's thinking, prominent like Denikin anti-Bolsheviks and so forth. So he says all classical political theories will merge into post-liberalism. He says the beginning of the 21st century coincides with the end of ideology and the end of history. Now, Putin is always, he said, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was the problem of lack of ideology. There was a sort of ideological vacuum. We had Soviet communism or Marxism defeated in 1991, and there's this ideological vacuum. There's nothing to replace it. Now, Putin always claimed himself to be not an ideologist, but in some sense, his thoughts were guided. I say his view is muscular militarism, right? But we need something to replace it. So here we have a notion of a fourth political theory, right? And Dugin argues for appropriating from Heidegger the notion of Dasein, which is being, but it doesn't mean, it means being in a particular way. Being means existing, but existing in a particular way where you have complete, for Heidegger, this is just a sketch of what he means by, but complete immersion in space and time, where in some sense you transcend space and time. You transcend the temporal, right? So now, in this, what Dugin thinks is that he's borrowing this notion of Dasein and that it's transcending the temporal. So once you get to this fourth political philosophy that focuses on Dasein, what we get is the need for no more political ideologies, because we become ideologically liberated, as it were. We go from freedom, philosophy of liberalism, to the philosophy where freedom itself, we're liberated from freedom, is a nice way of putting it. Here we have Dugin saying, freedom can be of any kind, free from any correlation or lack thereof, facing any direction and any goal. Freedom is the greatest value in the fourth political theory, since it coincides with its center in its dynamic, energetic core. Now, if anybody can tell me what the holy hell that means, I'm an analytic philosopher. I look at sentences and study words and try to come to an understanding what these things mean. I have no clue what he's talking about here. He's trying to say we get free from the constraints of the liberal notion of freedom, which is sort of like freedom from and freedom to, the notion of freedom from governmental intrusion in our affairs and freedom to do as we wish to do. But even that, Dugin seems to be saying, we're free from that. We are so free, we're free from liberal notion of freedom. And what that means is, who knows, as a political philosophy. So he thinks this leads us to sort of timeliness. I got my cat sitting out here, this Viscount Fingal. Okay, so what does the death of liberalism mean for Russia? He writes, the entirety of Russian history is a dialectical argument with the West and against Western culture. The struggle for upholding our own messianic ideal sent from God, an own version of the end of history, no matter how it is expressed through Muscovite orthodoxy, Peter the Great, secular empire, or the global communist revolution. We're looking back at Russian history and seeing all the greatness, even in the Soviet Union. And we're drawing from that to come into a sort of Russian messianic ideal. The brightest Russian minds clearly saw that the West was moving towards the abyss. Now looking at where neoliberal economics and postmodern culture has led the world, we can be certain that this intuition pushing generations of Russian people to search for alternatives was completely justified. It's clear that Russia needs to follow a different path, right? So we have this sort of messianic ideal that Russia itself, Moscow, is going to lead the way for the rest of the world to free itself from the constraints of liberal ideals, the shackles of the belief in human liberty, shackles from the belief that individuals ought to be awarded certain rights and so forth. We're going to free ourselves from that. What this alternative, if we take dot sign, literally, I am immersed in the world in a sort of timeless, in spaceless way, right? All this, to me, it's a wonderful ideal about which to think. But how does this reduce to a political ideal, if that's true? I'm not sure how seriously Putin takes Dugin. Dugin loves Putin. We know that. He says, his attack, the war against Ukraine 2022 is entirely justified because we need to instantiate these Russian ideals and so forth. All right, let's wrap this up and see what this means. So I wanted to say one answer to, why Putin moves in the direction in which he's moving is simply because he's a KGB person. He doesn't know how to do anything else. You take someone who's used to giving orders and give him the power to give orders. Take someone who's looking at minutiae and details and executing a plan, been given a plan and executing it till it's completed. That's Putin, all right. So that's the only way he knows how to act. The other answer is looking at the sort of people that Putin reads, that Putin is the sort of people that influence Putin, as I've tried to do here, and show just why he thinks the way he does. The third answer is, of course, that Putin was consistently enticed by, but ultimately snubbed by the West. So integration with the West was something that probably was not going to happen without a wholesale change in Russia's Weltanschauung, so Russia's worldview. Okay. So in sum, we can summarize Putin's muscular militarism as I see it thus. One, a vision of Russia as a motherland, Rodina, as a military mighty state and as a beacon of conservative Christian values for the globe, right? It's going to be like communism. Marxism is supposed to be an ideal for the globe, right? Jeffersonian liberalism. Jefferson was not shy about saying the liberal ideals articulated in Jeffersonian republicanism was an ideal that would be a contagion for the rest of the world, right? But it would be sort of voluntary acceptance. Two, the notion of Russia, a Russian state as an empire, much more than a nation. We can't think of it as a nation because it is too broad. Russia is too robust. It's a concept. It's too big to be delimited by the notions of nationhood. Three, detestation of Soviet Bolshevism, theoretically empty as a wasteful detour from the accretion of Russian imperialism. Four, commitment to the unity of the three Slavic states, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, that are in some sense based on common genealogy. And this union of the Slavic Union will be obviously based in Moscow. 5, refusal to recognize Ukraine as an ethnically distinct people, and hence refusal to its right to sovereignty. 6, obligation both to return eastern and southern Ukraine to Russia under the pretext of Ukrainian genocidal activities of neo-Marxists. That's the story that we get from Solzhenitsyn, Putin. These are the neo-Marxist people. They're causing genocide of Russophones. Well, and that's not the case at all. Most Ukrainians all over Ukraine, many of them speak Russian. So the base an argument that there's genocide against those people who speak Russians would be to say that Ukrainians are seeking the genocide of almost all Ukrainians, which is ridiculous. So in some sense, not just eastern and southern Ukraine, but also all of Ukraine, the annexation of all Ukraine, especially Kyiv. Now, notice it can't just be that Putin wants eastern and southern Ukraine, because if we all had our roots in Kyiv, then ultimately, what Putin is seeing, Solzhenitsyn is seeing, Dugin is seeing, is a return capture of all of Ukraine, or most of Ukraine at least, and perhaps making Kyiv the great mother of all cities, not Moscow. I think they do have that in mind. 7, espousal of the most brutish, sanguinary, bloody means for political aims which factor in the interest of the Russian people only in as much as they serve the interests of the states, right? So, this is what's going on. I think what Putin is trying to do is he's not anti-capitalist, because he's using, as many critics have said, sort of capitalist means to acquire this sort of great Russian empire, which, Moscow will be the center of this great Russian empire, as if Washington is sort of like, or at least has been sort of like, the prominent city behind NATO. So he has this in mind. He wants to use sort of capitalist means to partner with nations like India, South Africa, Brazil, Venezuela, perhaps Hungary, China, and so forth, and create a strong, predominantly economic alternative to NATO in the United States. And ultimately, Putin sees the demise of NATO, the demise of the European nations, the demise of liberalism as an ideal. He's not anti-capitalist, but he's certainly anti-liberalism. And he wants to see the demise of the United States. So what I've done here is I've tried to give you a window into the mind of Vladimir Putin. I think he's an enormously sick and sad person who is always focused on military conquest. He's in a state right now where he can't quit the war. The economy is so military driven. The manner of living of almost all Russian people is so penurious. They're living in such a state of great poverty that he's got to have something to show for 3+ years of fighting. He's got to show that it was worth something. He's got to take Ukraine, he sees, and perhaps even more than that. Other than that, because close to 900,000 soldiers have been killed in the process, and most of the people living in Russia are living in extraordinary poverty. Something will crack, something will give. So to return and end with this, I want to return with Vladimir Zelensky's thoughts that Putin will die soon. I believe that. I've said that. And I think what Zelensky's hinting at is that he will be overthrown and he will be liquidated. Things are so bad. The war is not, in spite of what commentators say, it's not going well for Russia at all. The drone strikes on oil refineries and things like that are causing, and the military capabilities of the Ukrainian army are alarmingly successful and modern in many respects. So things are going poorly for Russia, in spite of the fact that he's talking about the demise of England and Russia and NATO. He's going to turn his forces against NATO. He can't really do that. He doesn't have the fiscal wherewithal. He doesn't have the money to continue the war. he will, as Zelensky said, be targeted, overthrown, and liquidated, perhaps by a mutiny of his own soldiers, perhaps by oligarchs banding against him, perhaps by a large rebellion of the Russian peoples, welling up, I should say, in large cities like St. Pete and Moscow, and the Russian politicians having to do something about it. Anyways, next time, what I'm going to do, the third episode of this, is to give a psychoanalytical assessment of Vladimir Putin. And of course, it's not going to be a good one. He suffers from malignant narcissism, as a lot of people say. But I'm going to go thoroughly through all the various problems he has in his head, the way he sees the world, and why this is a bad thing for himself and for Russia and for the rest of the world. And it would be a very good thing to see him overthrown and liquidated. I hope you have enjoyed the show. I know it's a bit wordy, but it's a very important episode here of Eye on Ukraine, just to show how his political thinking has evolved and why he is so anti-Western. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, like it, share it with other people. And I say to you, TTFN, Tata for now. We'll do this again shortly.